What are you writing?
Names.
What are you writing?
I wrote the date.
The date. Okay. Anybody else? What are you writing?
I haven't written anything yet.
This evening's Dharma talk is titled, correct me if I'm wrong here, a moment. A moment has no sides. Is that correct? Good. That's very good. So that's the end of the talk. So what I'm by that title, what I'm hoping to talk a little bit about, and which I will, and then also appreciate any questions that come this way that help us all together go deeper into the material, whatever that may be. But the idea there is there is an assumption or a preconception about time, that it actually is something, that we can actually measure that, and that it's something that has a linear aspect to it, past to present to future. But to say a moment has no sides, what is being said is you can't really measure that. You can't go from this side of the moment to that side of the moment, and there are no sides. The concept there is pointing at something that we all often use. We use that word. Well, for the moment, I don't have anything to say. So we're always using that kind of an expression, quite often anyway. But rarely do we actually look at the nature of time itself. Dogen You could even say that an hour, a day, a week, a year, a lifetime has no sides. Just look, it really does look like it. And one of the reasons, because reasons are handy, that it looks that way is we think there is someone, we impute or imagine there's some kind of a being who is traveling through time, who has somewhere they've been and somewhere they're going. And we substantiate, validate, and reify that by memories of the past and imaginations about the future. I sometimes say, how do you know something is a plan? Because it doesn't work. Plans never work. Except for that one time where everything you planned, it worked out exactly that way. And you were so startled by it, you had a heart attack. So therefore, you're not in this room. So I'd like to have some discussion around that, and I'm happy to continue to talk. But if there's a questions right away, that might help me. Yes?
How do we move our awareness into time if it isn't real, or into what you're pointing at?
So we use concepts and let them take us as far as we can, like the idea of a moment having no sides. In other words, a moment in a relative sense doesn't actually exist. What's being pointed at there is forced into some kind of a dynamic where, well, a moment is just a really tiny piece of time. It's like the other example is sometimes used as for space. The thing for space is really interesting. And you can do the same thing with time, but the thing is, if you divide space in half, shorter and shorter and shorter, and you always divide it in half, you never can get to the point where there's nothing left to divide, because you're dividing whatever's there and those in half. You're always dividing in half. Kind of a paradox that helps us to see how really difficult it is to see the true nature of what this is, really true nature of what this is, which is what Dogen and other teachers down through the centuries, including the Buddha, of course, have been endeavoring to talk to us about. And as soon as you try to talk about it, you're lying, because you can't speak absolute truth. So but if you have some kind of understanding, some kind of insight into the fundamental nature of this, which if you've sat and looked at the wall for quite a long period of time, there's a good chance something will start to occur to you. Besides, it's just a wall there. Dogen addressed that idea of time in lots of ways. One of the ways another kind of a koan was that firewood does not become ash. Firewood is firewood, ash is ash. Does not become ash. So that's, and of course or maybe not of course, but quite often, self-centered mind, the ego mind, will say immediately, well, yes, it does. Because we have some wood and we burn it, we watch it become ash. But you can't actually find a time when it actually turns from firewood into ash. It's one way of talking about it.
It's more from Dogen in that chapter. I remember something along the lines of past doesn't get in the way of the future.
Mm-hmm.
Today during book study we had something similar of a mountain's walking forward doesn't interfere with a mountain's walking backwards or something like that. So I was wondering.
I don't remember that. That's pretty good. What did you come up with? So it's another way that Dogen endeavors to help his students back in the 3rd century, his disciples, to understand their Buddha nature, to help them approach that by talking in what we might call riddles or koans, or so that your logical, materialistic attitude mind that is fueled by the desire of ego or wanting this, not wanting that, wanting to be in charge of things, is kind of confounded by that. And so if you're sincere and you're serious about understanding what this teaching is, what the teaching of the Buddha is, going back 2,500 years, or Dogen going back to the 13th century, then you would give that the benefit of the doubt and you would try to contemplate that or understand that. And visitor. Yes, he left. So do you have a question about mountains and water, or mountains and river? It has a truth to it, but it's not fundamentally true. That didn't help it. Yes.
You brought up memories and something that gives us the illusion that we're someone that's like having this life. If it's not someone that's having those memories, what is it that contains those?
Just the dynamic of being an organism and having all of the causes and conditions that arise as your sixth sense feels, including the mind, all of that coming together. There's just the illusion that there is someone. It isn't that there isn't something, but it's not someone. It's just this, which is not separate from what Dogen was talking about. Go ahead.
What does seeing someone here stop us from seeing?
We tend to get enamored of ourselves. We tend to get enamored of ourselves in such a way that we want to improve ourselves. We want to have more advantages. So we tend to ignore everything else. It's as one of the ways to, since we're talking about Dogen, one of the ways that he described the difference between realization or enlightenment And delusion or confusion or insanity, various levels of that, is to say that when you go out towards the dharmas or towards the world, this is called delusion. And when you allow, you could say, the dharmas to come towards you, this is awakening. But usually we want something, or else we don't want something, or else we want to just not look at something or distract ourselves. Those are the three ways in which we avoid what this situation is: passion, aggression, and ignorance.
What's the difference between the falseness of time versus the cyclical nature of things?
So they're the same thing. They're not separate from each other, but they are separated by the merchandising mentality or the materialistic idea of the ego that wants some things and doesn't want others. So it will take the nature of what is arising, which is basically not separate, and divide it up into parts to its assumed advantage. We're not saying there aren't cycles. We're just saying that the complete cycle, understanding of the complete cycle, is a way of seeing the ultimate within the relative. To see that they're, in other words, you're not saying this is good and this is bad. We're not smushing them together, but we're saying they're not really separated in a way that the ego mind imputes or assumes or imagines. So it's always, as you've heard me say many times, it's always about awareness. It's not about getting somewhere and leaving somewhere else. It's always about the awareness of what is happening or what is arising more. David.
Is a moment complete?
What do you mean by complete?
Is a moment incomplete?
What do you mean by incomplete?
A moment.
So I would say it's complete, based on what you're saying, what you're asking about. It's a concept. It's a concept, but what actually is that? When we, just like the idea of dividing things, it's a very obvious thing. If you take this much space, you divide it in half, and you take what's left and divide that in half, it goes on and on and on. It might get extremely tiny, but there's always something left to divide it. There's always some kind of space left to divide up, theoretically. Not soteriologically or ontologically. Does anybody know what those words mean?
Bill Aldrin.
Bill Waldron knows, yes. We're going to question him when he comes here. Yes.
You say a moment has no sides. What's outside of a moment?
So, since you're using the concept of a moment, which we used, a moment ago I thought this, and a moment ago, so we use that in a relative way. But if we actually look at the moment itself, we can't really, to use another image, pinpoint, because even that is, as a not particularly precise, although we're using the image of a pin, which gives us the illusion of precision. So what's outside of the moment is about 15 or 20 other moments. There probably isn't anything outside of the moment. If you actually, to use the common thing that people are often telling us, when we're feeling miserable, the person next to you will say, you just have to stay in the moment. You notice that? People are always ready to, when you're feeling like crap and they're doing pretty good, then they'll say, well, just be here now, man. Good luck. So this isn't something to attach to or believe in or adapt, but it's something to be aware of. The idea is to be as aware as you can of whatever's coming and going without picking or choosing, without selecting or separating something out. So when I'm saying a moment has no size, it's just like, it's not something, it's not like like a period. You can actually, if you've got a microscope, you could say, well, there's an outside and an inside to the period. So it's not that kind of a thing that you can, the moment actually transcends the very thing that it seems to be appearing in, which is time and space. James.
Do we create problems for ourselves by putting sides on moments?
Probably. By attributing ideas, feelings, different structures to that situation, probably do. So this is what, when I say, and others have said, don't add. Whatever's arising, don't do anything with it. Don't add to it. Don't take away from it. As last few days, I've been reminded of the teaching of, I think it's Trangu Rinpoche, Tibetan master, who's still alive. Says, I think it was him that says, if you do nothing to thoughts, they will do nothing to you. So if you're sitting and you're having thoughts, don't do anything with them. Certainly don't add to them or judge them or subtract from it. Don't do anything with those thoughts that are arising. And that way they don't tumble into some kind of anxiety about what's happening or what should happen or what's going to happen, what could happen, or worry. Difficult to do if you're not a meditator. If you don't train your mind, then you're not going to be able to think your way into that kind of thing, because it's not about thinking. It's not about calculating, figuring out what to do. That's more or less assuming that you can somehow take a hold of this world of cause and effect, this world of time and space, and squeeze some kind of happiness out of it. Probably not going to work. Maybe a little bit here and there, and then we live from one happiness moment to the next. Yes.
Do we still feel something like anxiety or worry if we're just observing our thoughts?
Yes, you can. And then that's part of what makes it so difficult, is because when we've been working and trying to not add to that, endeavoring to just not build up any kind of case against everything, but just be with whatever's happening or look at what's happening or observe, and then things start to feel worse, then instead of just letting it do whatever it needs to do, we start to add on to that and say, well, have little tiny post-it notes we put on things. Well, this must mean, or that must mean. Well, it must mean I'm not meditating right. It must mean I'm if I were doing this correctly, I'd feel better. Unnecessarily. And a simple description of that you probably have heard me say before is, especially for someone who's just been meditating for a few months or even a few years, you may have been spending a lot of time before you even got to the cushion or to the place where you can sharpen your awareness. You may have been spending a lot of time covering up your difficulties. So then when you finally do sit down and look, that tends to start uncovering that stuff you've been, common word is repressing or holding back or hiding out from or pretending wasn't there, covering up. So you might have to go through a period of time or a Dharma gate where you need to relate to whatever negativity is coming your way without doing anything about it. Don't add to it, don't analyze it, don't attribute or blame someone or some situation. Even if it's true, don't blame. That's what the ego does. The ego will say, well, they actually did that. No wonder I'm feeling bad, because they did that. But it's cyclic. And you have to see the entire cycle. If you see the entire cycle, then it's called samsara, the Sanskrit word for that circle. Then you won't go to war with anything because you'll understand that it's always tipping this way and tipping that way. Go ahead.
Are feelings rooted in belief?
Probably. Thinking something's true and something else is false. Go ahead.
Is there sensation without belief?
Yeah. You knew that already, though. Oh, you're testing me. Yes, there are. Anything is possible in that area. You might find that it usually doesn't happen, but then there will be that time when there's a black swan, as the title of Suzuki Roshi's book. I don't. It's just a teaching he gave. I think somebody else put the title on the book because it's published long after he passed away. But the title of the book is Not Always So. We can't find anything that's always the case. Everything is changing. So this is a difficult topic to ramble on and on about. So that's why I'm saying if you ask questions, we can keep going. But otherwise, I'm just going to sit here and watch time go by. Yes.
Earlier you said we get enamored with ourselves and we ignore everything else.
We do.
You often suggest to flash on our senses
I do.
when we're in a difficult situation. Even if we're flashing on our senses or we're staying in our senses, are we still missing something?
No. No, you're including things you normally ignore. If you'll notice that when you're worried about something, all the awareness leaves your sense of touch, it leaves your sense of seeing, it abandons your sense of hearing, and all your other senses and just sucks up into the thinking process and worries, or thinks, or calculates, or analyzes, tries to get from point A to point B, from this side of the moment to the other side of the moment. As you know, a moment is hollow inside. You knew that. It's just like a little bubble of momentariness. Unless there's a hole in it. Or it's a good area to go if you have another question around that. Senses don't lie. Feeling, seeing. I mean, you can be fooled. That's why we're quite enamored by magic tricks, because we so much just totally trust our senses. If we see something, seeing is believing, as they say. I don't know who they is, but those guys. You see it, and so if somebody comes up and, the magician's there, and the magician pulls up the hat, and then what happens? She reaches down inside the hat and pulls out what?
A rabbit.
A rabbit. A lion? Yeah, like that. And then what would you say? That looked real. And then 5 people all watching, one says, I don't believe that. That's a trick. Someone else says, well, I just saw it. Seeing is believing. Another person will say, I don't like lions. Say, what happened to the rabbit? Everybody's thinking some other thing about it. It's just, it's called Not Always So. So we hear something that the other, some of the, like taste, it's pretty hard to fool your sense of taste. You put something sweet in your mouth, it's sweet. Put something sour, it's sour. Or if you don't like a particular thing, you're not going to trick somebody that doesn't like something into eating something that's all dressed up or looks like that necessarily. Although they say that if you take an apple and a potato and tell somebody that it's, the sense of taste kind of gives way to the sense of seeing, and the seeing part takes over and tells you communicates to the mind, not an apple, it's a potato kind of thing. That's, I'm gonna write a book about that. Better have a bunch of illustrations, yes.
Is the mind always fixated on something?
Looks like it. Unless it's not. Do we have anyone on the internet? I know Sokuzan and Rushin are watching.
Are they?
Yeah, they told me they were. Of course,
I don't see them.
yeah, I don't know. They might not be telling the truth.
No, I got a message from Terry DuPerrin over in the Detroit area who says the signal's going in and out. So I don't know if it's the rain here or YouTube or what it is. So.
Well, anytime you talk about moments, it tends to.
Just wait a moment.
Yeah, wait a moment.
And things will
Very
change.
good.
Isn't that how it goes?
Wait a moment. Yeah. Further questions about this, or about anything for that matter? Here's something that we're not talking about. Yes.
What doesn't feel like the senses gives us enough information?
So that's when we have the senses arise, and then we're using those senses, or we're going to the sense of touch, or the sense of hearing, or seeing, and then we add to that some kind of analysis about it. That it's, like you said, it's not enough, because we're looking for content. And the content is not as important. Like when I say we're having book study, you might come and study Bill Waldron's book, or possibly Jeffrey Hopkins, or some other challenging intellectual, conceptual presentation of various aspects of the Dharma, and feel, because you have an expectation, there's a certain way you're supposed to understand this, and when it doesn't feel like you're quite getting to it, then there's kind of maybe a feeling of failure, or not being so good, or maybe not even liking that text just because it's too challenging. And I say what's important about that is the awareness that's happening around trying to work with that material, not success in understanding it, or being highly intelligent or erudite, or conceptually gifted. It's more about the awareness around what that is, rather than some kind of accomplishment mentality. So same thing when we're talking about the senses. I teach the alternating sense awareness practice, so that when someone is overwhelmed by emotions or thoughts, so rather than just be totally at the mercy of that, you could actually deliberately go to something that is already here. It's already in the present moment, as they say, where there's no sides, and how this feels, how this looks, colors. Just receive the very basic object in any one of the sense fields, just sound, not what kind of sound or what's making the sound, but just the sound, or just the sight, just the texture of something, the color of something. To include that with the thought process that's giving you a hard time, or where you're fretting or worrying about that, it changes the way in which you relate to the thought process. It's not something you can particularly evaluate. That's why sitting practice of meditation doesn't particularly provide you with credentials, other than you could say, I sat for 6 hours today, which doesn't help a lot if you're feeling like crap. And this is why I would say, do it anyway. Practice anyway. Because if you believe your thoughts and feelings and opinions and emotions, if you believe all that, you'll leave here. You won't come back. You'll go, start a cigar factory. Well, probably not a cigar factory, but you start what could you start? Necco wafer factory. That would be good. They just went out of business. So you should start one of them. One of those. But we get discouraged by something, and so that's why this is a spiritual path, is about working in a different way with the negativity that arises in the mind. And how is that a different way? We're not going to run away from it. We're not going to make up a bunch of excuses or ideas about it to help make us feel better for 20 minutes. And we're not going to ignore it. We're not going to abandon it or go away. And it may not be whoever's here, whoever's watching. It may not be for you to do this. I'm not here to promote this necessarily. If you want to do this, then I will help. If you don't, then do whatever you want to do. Yes, sir.
What does it mean to be alone on this path?
It starts out as feeling lonely. You're with a lot of other people. They're all practicing. You're practicing. And you notice that you might feel lonely. And it's not that you don't have friends or Dharma brothers and sisters or people that are studying the same thing. But there's as we approach that aspect of the consciousness that is harbor, that has a little safe harbor called the seventh consciousness, or that area that kind of goes into a cocoon kind of form, that's actually going to come apart. And so the loneliness is part of isolating oneself from others. Even though you're with others, you're isolating yourself. And at some point, as long as there's some sense that I am somebody, then there can be loneliness. But when one sees, and I don't know if it's a point in time or not, I can't really talk about it that way, because I don't have any point in time where anything particular happened to me. But here I am talking about this. So who knows? Maybe nothing occurred at all. But at some point, you're just alone. You no longer need anything. I'm not saying that if you have a toothache, you don't need something to stop that from hurting. Of course, I'm not ridiculous about it, but you're no longer in some kind of a wanting something else. You're here, want something else. Most human beings, or wherever they're at, they want something else. They want more of something and less of another thing. And the one who has realized aloneness doesn't want anything. They don't want company. They don't want to be left alone. They don't particularly want something else. And this is the truth of the Buddha's teaching. The truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, the truth of the goal, and the truth of the path. So there's no longer any else to create difficulty. Yes, sir.
I'm not understanding. How can there be are you saying there's aloneness without ego?
Yes.
How can there be aloneness without ego?
Because nothing is separate. There isn't anybody else. All the company has left. You're all by yourself with a whole room to clean up where everybody's left a bunch of bottles and cigarette butts. I'm sorry, I was born a long time ago. That's how the party is over. So.
What are you alone from then?
So, good point. So that's how it starts out as that way, but eventually even that doesn't work. It works as a way of talking about it to help someone understand that there is some kind of a progression happening as we practice, where we may feel lonely for quite a while. It's possible, depending on the causes and conditions that arise as your particular karma. You may not go through that. Everyone's Dharma gate or everyone's psychology or whatever is different. So some people don't have that at all. Just like some people have very little pride. I mean, obvious, and other people are just loaded with pride. And some people don't. Jealousy area is very low, but then other people are extremely just always looking for more territory for themselves and get really upset if somebody else gets credit or gets something they think they should have gotten. So the whole idea of lonely, and if you feel lonely, then it probably will end up in aloneness. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, and so then the not separate may or may not come subsequently?
May or may not.
And if it does, then that sense of aloneness is kind of not there, kind of doesn't matter, or
Yes, it's not something you need to do anything about.
Our concern.
As Coben says, I use this all the time because it's just such a great teaching, where he translates the Heart Sutra of Gate Gate Par Sam Gate Bodhisattva. Did you chant that tonight? So the mantra at the end of the Heart Sutra, and it's gone beyond, gone completely beyond, awake, so be it, is the English translation of that. That's fairly common, but his translation, Coben's translation of that, if you understood that, was falling apart, falling apart, falling apart, nothing to do. So he was talking about, I didn't chat with him about it, but near as I can tell, probably talking about that the self-centeredness, the ego just falls apart. It doesn't mean you don't have feelings. It doesn't mean you don't have fears. It doesn't mean you don't even have maybe hopes for this or that or the other thing. But the grasping part of it, the fixation part, is what's going on. So therefore, what seems to rise in the place of the demand of the fixation is, for lack of a better expression, I would say, a sense of humor.
When you were talking about flashing on the senses, like if we're up in our heads worrying about something, when that worrying or story that we concocted has started to translate into what seems like feeling that, is there still truth in that feeling?
How do you mean truth?
I don't remember exactly.
If you feel it, then that's true. I mean, if it's true, you're feeling it. I'm not saying that you're not feeling it. I'm saying that's true, but that doesn't point to something else. It's just that. It's like a moment with no sides. It's just that. It takes up no time and no space, unless you're out there with some kind of a ruler measuring things. You can take anything that occurs and turn it into some kind of a thing. Physicists do it all the time. They're having a big big problem with subatomic stuff because it doesn't want to hold still long enough to be measured. Darn it. So, and they're trying to not go so far in that they suddenly step on the spiritual path. Got tricked into it. The God particle. Yes, go ahead.
Sokuran and Rushina are with us.
I knew they were.
And Sokuran has a question.
All right.
She asks, meditation can be so quiet while simultaneously there is death and destruction and birth and hurricanes occurring somewhere else. Does the moment include everything, even in the silence?
Yes. I had to think about that for a while, just for a moment. I just kind of bounced off one wall of the moment over to the other side of the moment, and the light went off, the light bulb above your head. Yes, I really thought about that. Not. Yes, David.
What's the sense of time?
What is the sense of time?
Yes.
Things moving. Without anything moving, we don't know. That's why when you're doing sitting meditation, those of you who've done quite a bit of this can attest, as if we needed to attest anything. But if you sit down, that your sense of time is based on things coming and going, movement, something that needs to be moving. Because if you sit there for a while, eventually the sense of time just drops away. Might take a while, but eventually you can sit here and not have any particular experience of time coming or going. That actually can happen when you're not meditating also, but they usually lock you up. Put you in one of those, what do they call those? Jail, yes.
think you said our sense of time is based on things moving.
Yes.
So if we're meditating or not, our body, things internally are still moving. So how can there be no sense of time when movement is still occurring?
I don't know. Maybe you would ignore it. Maybe you'd be in a daydream or something, watching something go this way, which there's a different kind of time happening there. How's your doing the dream project that you've been working on? Is that your sense of time in that? Is that showing up differently, Chazon?
Outside of dreaming? Or within?
In the dream?
I think it's pretty curious how you can actually, the amount of time that passes in a dream is pretty similar to the amount of time that passes awake, although the scenes could go by like decades. But you still know it occurred in a 5-minute time frame.
More about that?
I don't know how to go into it deeper.
Nor do I. That's why I'm asking you. Since you.
Can we go into memories or ideas about the future without reinforcing someone moving through time?
I think as long as there's no demand going on, it's the demand and the fixation. The demand for something else and the fixation on something that we're afraid is going to change. We tend to tighten down on something if it gets too movable. Then we want to tighten down on it so we feel secure. And so I think if there's no demand, then things can come and go. If one has transcended the personal self, in other words, realized no separation, then the things that are not separate come and go all the time. You have emotions and feelings and memories, and things are just free to do whatever they want to do. So you're no longer objecting to anything, you're no longer agreeing with anything, and you're no longer shutting things out particularly, unless you do. But even that's not a problem. Not always so. Anything is possible. Anything can occur. There's no rule of thumb, or there's no notches on the workbench or any of that that tells you, oh, finally now I have this or have that. That's completely gone. You have no reassurance. This is my teacher, Trungpa Rinpoche, used to call that seminar he did once. The title of it was Buddha Dharma, or Awakened to Truth. You awaken to what is fundamentally true, not just relatively, but what's fundamentally true. Buddha Dharma, without credentials, without any guarantee. There's no diploma, there's no merit badge, there's nothing. More?
How can we have no demand?
By not demanding.
What if we have demands? Then how do we go into that situation?
So if anything that comes up that is about warfare or demand or any extreme where you're grasping at something, which we all have some experience of this. I mean, it might not be noticeable to someone sitting next to us, but in our mind we sometimes call it struggling with things. This is coming and that's going, and we reify it or convince ourselves that it's okay to fret about this because this is happening here, or we're running out of money, or we're just any number of things. So it's not that you don't think about it at all. We're not talking about ignoring it so that it goes away, or the artificial ignorance, of course, is drugs. We can't just ignore it, so we just drug ourselves. Some people are able to do that without taking any drugs. They just buy into their opinions and their ideas, and they might as well be drugged in some sense because they just believe this is true, and that's how they operate out of that fixation. Sometimes you can recognize that some people operate out of really strong, tight beliefs about the nature of the world and the nature of who they are and the nature of everything. If you're not doing that, it's pretty painful to be around someone like that. Quite often it happens with our parents. If Not always, but if we don't have mind training of some kind, as we get older, as people get older, they get more and more fixed on, because the death starts staring us in the face after a while. So we start to get more and more fixed on what we believe and what's true and what we should do and what's really valuable in life and all of that.
That question that Sokuzan asked, it was really from both of them, Rushine and Sokuzan. I was supposed to tell you that. And then
Well, then that changes my answer. What?
And then Rushine has a question.
All right. Go ahead.
She asks, what is your experience of time?
Comes and goes.
When you're eating ice cream?
It slows way down. Yeah, and then when I get about halfway through the bowl of ice cream, then I start to fret about it's going to be gone pretty quick. And then I don't enjoy the last half as much, because I've added on to that, it's starting to disappear. You know, when it's 3/4, only a quarter gone, then you've got all that big. So, right, life is good. More ice cream. But then as you eat it, you know, it's pretty soon it's just little, and then you know what I'm talking about. There's a teaching in Buddhism, this is called the pain of alternation. And it's like things that you like going away, like life. Oh, we've got 3 minutes left. That's probably about 560 moments. All hooked together without sides. Yes.
You were talking earlier about a sense of progress or progression on the path, and that seems to be tied to an idea of time passing.
Mm-hmm.
But if that time isn't real, is the sense of progress, what happens to that sense of progress?
If you actually realize, and when I say realize, you're no longer at war with anything, you no longer want something else, and you have no credential. You have nothing to prove to anyone. I'm not saying you wouldn't disagree about some particular thing. Sure, you might, but as soon as if you see that person's at war that you're disagreeing with, then you lose the war immediately. Don't fight with anyone who's warlike. When I say lose the war, I'm not saying, crawl away like a worm or something. I'm saying be kind to the person that's having difficulty. Even if you don't particularly feel like it, do it anyway. Be kind to that person, because they're struggling. Maybe you're not. But if you have a credential, then you have something to protect. So if someone accuses you of anything, you immediately feel, whereas if you're clear about what this whole thing is about, then if somebody accuses you, what you see is their need to be accusing you rather than you feeling blamed. If there isn't anyone here who can't find somebody to blame. More about that would be good if you have it, Sato.
Not right now, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, you don't have to whisper it. We're out of moments. Apparently, the moments collected and they got back to back, stacked up and created an hour or whatever it was. Final question from anyone? Very good. Thank you so much.
We'll stand and dedicate the merit in the back of our red chant books. I'd like to again call your attention to the donation boxes in the hallway. Still there to accept your financial support, which we can always use. Thank you.
May the merit of this penetrate into all places, so that we and every sentient being together can realize the Buddha's way. Ji-ho-san, shi-shi-fu, shi-son-bu-sa, mo-ko-sa, mo-ko-ja-ho-ro-mi. The 10 directions, the 3 worlds, all Buddhas, all venerable ones, Bodhisattvas, Mahasattvas, the great Prajna, Paramita.
O Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the 10 directions and the 3 times, please hear us. Please come down out of the light and protect Sokukoji Buddhist Temple Monastery, our Sangha, families, friends, and visitors. Heal everyone who is unhappy, sick, or suffering, and fill them with light.